Hello, and welcome back. If you're joining us for the first time, glad you found your way here. And if you've been around for a while, you already know what we do. We sit down, we slow down, and we let a good story do what good stories are supposed to do. Take us somewhere else for a little while. Tonight's story is one I've been wanting to tell for some time now. It begins in London, 1883. A cold October, the kind where the fog doesn't fully lift even by noon, and the streets smell like wet stone and coal smoke. Outside the grand Whitmore Library, a building that had stood since the 1700s, older than most of the city's living memory, something strange had started happening. The gargoyle above the library's main entrance had begun to weep. Not rain, not condensation, something dark. Something that looked, and to anyone who stopped and stared long enough, disturbingly like blood. The city noticed. The city whispered, and then the head librarian vanished, quietly, without warning, without a single goodbye. And the whispers turned into something louder. Sherlock Holmes noticed too, so pour yourself something warm, find a comfortable spot, and stay a while. This one moves slowly at first, the way all good mysteries should, and then, when it moves fast. Let's begin. The Weeping Stone. The first person to see it was a postman. His name was Gerald Briggs, and he had been walking the same route through Bloomsbury for 11 years. He knew every crack in every pavement slab, every loose iron gate, every dog that would bark and everyone that wouldn't. He was not, by any measure, a man given to imagination or dramatics. His wife would have told you the same thing. Gerald Briggs noticed facts. He delivered letters. He went home. That was the shape of his life, and he was perfectly content with it. So when Gerald stopped dead on the morning of October the 4th, his leather satchel half open and a bundle of envelopes loose in his hand, and stared up at the front face of the Whitmore Library with an expression his wife had never once seen on his face in 23 years of marriage, it meant something. It meant whatever he was looking at was real. The Whitmore Library sat at the quieter end of a wide, tree-lined street in Bloomsbury, the kind of street that felt slightly removed from the rest of London, as though it existed at a different pace. The building itself was old in the way that very few buildings manage to be old. Not crumbling, so not patched over with modern awkwardness, but settled, confident. It had thick stone walls the colour of pale ash, tall, narrow windows with iron frames, and a set of broad front steps worn smooth by a century and a half of readers coming and going. Above the main entrance, carved directly into the stone arch, was a gargoyle. It had been there since the library was built in 1741. Generations of librarians had worked beneath it. Thousands of visitors had passed under it without a second glance. It was simply part of the building, part of the furniture in a way, a grotesque hunched figure with wide hollow eyes and a jaw thrust slightly forward, as though permanently on the verge of saying something unpleasant. Local children had given it a name at some point, though no one could quite remember when. They called it Old Mordecai. Not on the morning of October the 4th, old Mordecai was crying. From both hollow eyes, thin dark trails ran down the stone face of the arch. They were slow, those trails, not dripping exactly, more like seeping, and they had dried in places, leaving dark reddish-brown streaks against the pale stone. In the grey morning light, with the fog still sitting low over the street, it looked, there was really no other word for it, it looked like the thing was bleeding. Gerald Briggs stood there for a full minute. Then he did what any sensible man would do. He walked to the nearest phone box and called the police. By 10 o'clock that morning, a small crowd had gathered on the pavement outside the library. Word had moved quickly, the way it always does when the thing being described is strange enough to repeat. A market trader on the next street heard it from a woman buying apples. A schoolteacher heard it from the market trader. By the time the first constable arrived to have a look, there were already 14 or 15 people standing at a respectful distance from the front steps, heads tilted back, staring up at old Mordecai with a mixture of fascination and something that sat just at the edge of unease. The constable, a young man named P.C. Holloway, only 8 months on the job, looked up at the gargoyle, wrote something in his notebook, and then stood there for a moment not entirely sure what to do next. There was no law against a statue appearing to bleed. There was no procedure for it. He asked a few people to move along. Nobody moved along. He wrote something else in his notebook and radioed for someone more senior. The more senior officer arrived, looked up at the gargoyle, and suggested it was probably just rainwater mixed with rust from some internal iron fitting. Perfectly logical. perfectly reasonable. The crowd nodded politely and then continued staring. By the afternoon, someone had taken a photograph, and by the following morning it had made the inside pages of 2 London newspapers. Not front page, there was a miners' strike ongoing and a cabinet reshuffle to report, but inside pages with a headline that read, "In the way that inside page headlines do when they are trying to be both informative and entertaining at once. Bloomsbury, Gargoyle weeps. Locals are nerved." It was, in the grand scheme of things, a small story, a curiosity, the kind of thing people clip out and pin to kitchen notice boards and forget about within a week. Except it didn't stop. The following morning, the trails were fresh again, darker, if anything, and the morning after that, whatever was seeping from those hollow stone eyes was not a one-time occurrence, not a trick of trapped rainwater finding an unusual exit. It was happening repeatedly, consistently, and it was getting worse. By the end of the first week, the crowd outside the library had grown considerably. People were coming from other parts of London now, not just the neighbourhood, to have a look for themselves. There were those who brought cameras. There were those who brought rosary beads. There was one man who arrived each morning at 7:30 and simply stood in silent contemplation for 45 minutes before walking away without speaking to anyone. The library itself continued to operate. Miss Glenys Fowler, the deputy librarian, a brisk, no-nonsense woman in her mid-50s who wore her grey hair in a tight bun and had strong opinions about the Dewey Decimal System, had made it quietly but firmly clear that the business of the library would not be interrupted by what she referred to as this gargoyle business. Books were returned, books were borrowed, reading groups met on Tuesday evenings as they always had. But the reading numbers were down. Footfall inside the building had dropped noticeably in the second week. People were happy enough to stand outside and look up, but going in, passing directly beneath old Mordecai and those dark, weeping eyes, that was a different matter. Something about it put people off. Something about it felt, in a way that was very difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't stood there themselves, faintly wrong. And then, on the morning of October the 14th, 10 days after Gerald Briggs had first stopped on the pavement with his letters loose in his hand, the head librarian did not come to work. His name was Edmund Ashford. He had run the Whitmore Library for 16 years. He was 61 years old, a widower, a man of careful habits and predictable routine. He caught the same bus every morning. He arrived at the library at 8:45, not 8:40 or 8:50, but 8:45. He made himself 1 cup of tea upon arriving, read through whatever correspondence had accumulated, and began his day. On October the 14th, the 8:45 bus came and went. Edmund Ashford was not on it. Miss Fowler assumed he was unwell and carried on. By the following morning, when he had still not appeared and had not telephoned, she began to feel a crawling sort of worry that she did her best to suppress. By the third morning, she telephoned the police. They went to his flat. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was in its place. His coat on the hook, his reading glasses on the table beside his chair, a library book open face down on the arm of the sofa as though he had simply stepped out for a moment and intended to return shortly. He had not returned, and outside, above the entrance to his library, old Mordecai went on weeping. The faddishest librarian. The morning Watson brought it up, Holmes was in the middle of doing nothing in particular. That was not unusual. There were stretches, sometimes days, occasionally longer, when Holmes existed in a kind of suspended state between cases. He would sit in his chair by the window, or pace the length of the sitting room, or play the violin at odd hours with a distracted, searching quality, as though the music were a question he hadn't yet found the answer to. Mrs. Hudson had learned, over the years, to simply leave his meals outside the door during these periods and not take it personally when they came back untouched. Watson had learned something similar. He had learned not to attempt conversation during the deep silences, not to suggest fresh air or exercise, and above all, not to say, as he had made the mistake of saying once early in their acquaintance, that perhaps Holmes simply needed a good night's sleep. The look he had received in response to that suggestion was not one he was eager to invite again. So on that particular Wednesday morning in mid-October, Watson settled into his own chair with his tea and his newspaper, and left Holmes to whatever interior landscape he was currently wandering through. He read about the miners. He read about the cabinet. He turned a page and read a short piece about a football match he had no particular interest in. He turned another page, and that was when he saw it, tucked into the lower half of the page, 3 columns wide beneath a photograph that was slightly too dark to make out properly. Whitmore librarian missing. Police appeal for information. Watson read it once quickly, the way one reads things that haven't yet registered as significant. Then he read it again, more slowly. Edmund Ashford, 61, head librarian of the Whitmore Library in Bloomsbury. Eyre had been reported missing by colleagues after failing to appear for work on 3 consecutive days. Police had attended his residence and found it undisturbed, with no indication of planned travel or voluntary absence. Mr. Ashford had no known family in London. Colleagues described him as a man of rigid routine who had not taken unplanned leave in 16 years of service. The disappearance came amid what the newspaper called continued public interest in an unusual phenomenon at the library's facade, a gargoyle above the entrance that had been observed to produce dark fluid from its eye sockets on multiple consecutive mornings, a sight which had drawn considerable attention from local residents and visitors alike. Watson lowered the paper. Across the room, Holmes had not moved. He was in his chair at an angle that looked deeply uncomfortable, one long leg thrown over the armrest, his fingers pressed together at the tips in that characteristic arch he adopted when thinking. His eyes were open but focused on nothing visible. "Holmes," Watson said. Nothing. "Holmes," a little louder, a slow blink. Then, without moving anything else, "The librarian." Watson looked down at the paper, then back up. "You've seen it already." "Yesterday evening, the early edition." Holmes unfolded himself from the chair in a single unhurried motion and crossed to the window, hands in the pockets of his dressing gown. He stood looking down at Baker Street for a moment, the familiar view, the traffic below, a woman walking a small dog on the opposite pavement. "And," Watson said, "and nothing yet. There is not enough." He said it simply, without frustration, the way a carpenter might say a piece of wood is not yet the right length. A statement of current fact, nothing more. A man of fixed habits who vanishes without disturbing his own flat. A strange occurrence at his place of work in the days preceding. The police will assume he has had some kind of breakdown, stress perhaps, or a private crisis they haven't yet uncovered. They will look in the obvious places. They will not find him in the obvious places. You sound quite certain of that. I am quite certain of that, he turned from the window. What I am not yet certain of is what the gargoyle has to do with it. Watson set the newspaper on the table between them. You think they're connected? I think a man does not vanish from a library that has suddenly become the subject of public fascination and have that be entirely coincidental. I think coincidences of that particular shape are very rare in my experience. He picked up the newspaper, looked at the photograph, the dark front face of the library, the pale stone arch, the gargoyle just visible at the top of the frame, and set it back down. But I also think the obvious connection may not be the correct one. Meaning I am not yet ready to mean anything. I need to see the building. They arrived at the Whitmore Library just after 2 o'clock that afternoon. The crowd outside was smaller than it had been in the first week. Watson had half expected chaos, based on the newspaper reports. But there were still perhaps 20 or 25 people gathered on the pavement, standing in loose clusters looking up. A few had cameras. A teenager near the steps was sketching something in a notebook. An older woman in a heavy coat stood slightly apart from the others with her arms folded, staring upward with an expression of deep personal offense, as though the gargoyle had said something rude to her specifically. Watson looked up. He had read the descriptions, had seen the photograph, and had formed in his mind a reasonably clear picture of what to expect. But there was still something about seeing it directly, in the dull grey afternoon light, against the pale stone of the old building, that made him pause. The dark trails ran down from both eye sockets in thin, dried channels, or branching slightly at the chin of the carved face before petering out against the arch below. They were not fresh at this hour. Whatever the mechanism was, it seemed to occur primarily in the mornings, but the staining was dark enough and extensive enough that the effect remained. The gargoyle looked unmistakably as though it had been weeping for a very long time. "Unpleasant," Watson said, before he could stop himself. Holmes said nothing. He was already on the front steps. He did not look up at the gargoyle, which Watson found immediately interesting. While every other person within 50 yards had their head tilted back and their attention fixed on the carved face above, Holmes was looking at the steps themselves. He moved slowly, with that particular quality of attention he had, not visibly intense, Not dramatic, just entirely, unquietly present, and crouched down near the base of the arch, examining the stone at foot level. Watson climbed the steps and stood beside him. "What are you looking at?" "The step here is worn differently from the others," Holmes indicated with one finger, not touching. "The second step from the top. You see the pattern of wear? The others are worn evenly across the width, decades of feet crossing the full span. This one has a groove here toward the left edge, narrow, repeated. Something has been wheeled across it or dragged. Not recently, it has had time to weather, but more recently than the general wear on the other steps." Watson looked. He could see it, once it was pointed out. A faint channel in the stone, perhaps 4 inches wide, running from the left side of the step toward the door. "Could be anything," Watson offered. Deliveries, book trolleys." "Possibly," Holmes stood. "Probably, even. I don't know yet what it means." He said this in a perfectly ordinary tone, and Watson noted it, because Holmes admitting he didn't know something was not always a small thing. "Shall we go inside?" Miss Glenys Fowler met them in the entrance hall. She was exactly as Watson had somehow expected. Upright, precise, with the faintly exhausted air of a person who has been managing other people's chaos for several weeks, and is doing so through sheer force of personal organisation. She shook Holmes's hand with a firm, businesslike grip, and looked at him with the appraising directness of someone who had decided, before he arrived, to be helpful rather than difficult. "You'll want to see his office," she said, without preamble. "Among other things," Holmes said. "But yes, or his office first." She led them through the main reading room, high-ceilinged, lined floor-to-ceiling with dark shelves, smelling wonderfully of old paper and furniture polish. And Watson noticed again how quiet it was. There were readers at perhaps a third of the tables. Normally, he imagined, on a Wednesday afternoon in term time, a library like this would be considerably fuller. "Has the attendance dropped significantly?" he asked Miss Fowler. She glanced back at him. 40% down on last month. In the first week after people started talking about the Gargoyle, we had several regulars who simply stopped coming. I've had 2 reading group members telephone to say they'd prefer to meet elsewhere for the time being." The set of her jaw suggested what she thought of that. It's a library. It has stood for 240 years. A bit of discoloration on a stone figure should not be keeping people away from their books. "And yet it is," Holmes said quietly, from just behind her. She didn't answer that. She pushed open a door at the back of the reading room and led them into a narrow corridor. Edmund Ashford's office was a small, orderly room at the end of the corridor. A desk, a chair, shelves of reference books and administrative files. A single window looking out onto a small internal courtyard. Everything was tidy. Everything was in its place. There was something almost theatrical about the tidiness, Watson thought. The way the room looked exactly as an occupied room should look, as though its owner might walk back in at any moment, settle into the chair, and resume whatever he'd been doing. On the desk, beside a neat stack of correspondence, sat a cold cup of tea. Watson looked at it. That hasn't been touched since he left. "Miss Fowler," Holmes said, "has anyone moved anything in this room since Mr. Ashford was reported missing?" "No. The police asked us to leave it as we found it. I've kept it locked." She produced a key from her cardigan pocket, which she was now holding rather than having used, Watson realised. The door had already been unlocked when she opened it. He filed that away without comment. Holmes moved around the desk slowly, not touching anything, looking. He examined the surface of the desk, the position of the correspondence, the single drawer that sat very slightly open. Not enough to be obvious, just a fraction of an inch. He looked at the window. He looked at the floor near the far corner of the room, where a small bookshelf met the wall. He stood very still for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me, Miss Fowler, has this room always had a bookshelf in that corner?" She turned to look. "Yes, as long as I've worked here." "And have those particular books always been shelved in that order?" She frowned, looking at the shelf. It held a row of reference volumes, encyclopedias, a dictionary, a set of historical almanacs. They looked to Watson like books that had always been in exactly that position. "I wouldn't know the precise order," Miss Fowler said carefully. "I don't use that shelf myself." Holmes nodded slowly. He did not crouch down to look more closely. He did not pull any books from the shelf. He simply stood and looked at it for a moment longer, with that expression Watson knew well, the one that meant something had registered, and something had been filed, something was now sitting in a particular corner of that extraordinary mind, waiting. "Right," he said eventually. "I think I've seen enough for today." Watson looked at him. "Have you?" "For today," Holmes repeated, and there was something in the way he said it, a small, careful emphasis, that told Watson quite clearly that he had not, in fact, seen anywhere near enough, that he had seen something, possibly several things, that Watson had missed entirely, and that he was not, at least not yet, going to say what they were. They thanked Miss Fowler. They walked back through the quiet reading room, past the half-empty tables and the high shelves and the smell of old paper. They came out through the main entrance under the arch beneath the hollow-eyed face of old Mordecai. Watson glanced up as they passed beneath it. Holmes did not. Holmes takes the case. He didn't sleep that night. Watson knew this not because he heard anything. Holmes, when he was thinking, could be extraordinarily still, extraordinarily quiet. But because when Watson came downstairs at 7:30 the following morning, the sitting room held the particular quality of a space that had been occupied for a long time without rest. The fire had burned low and been fed again, at least once. There were 3 empty cups on the side table. The violin was on the sofa rather than in its case, which meant it had been played at some point in the small hours. Softly enough not to wake anyone, but played. And Holmes was standing at the window in the same clothes he'd been wearing the day before, looking out at Baker Street with his hands clasped behind his back. Watson said nothing. He went to the kitchen, spoke briefly to Mrs. Hudson, and returned with 2 fresh cups of tea. He set one on the windowsill beside Holmes and took his own to his chair. After a while, Holmes said, "The smell." Watson waited. "When we were standing on the steps yesterday, you didn't notice it." "I noticed the cold," Watson said, "and something faintly chemical, I thought. I assumed it was cleaning fluid of some kind. A building that old, they must use all manner of things on the stonework." "They do." Holmes picked up his tea without turning from the window. "But cleaning fluid on exterior stonework has a particular character. It dissipates quickly in open air. What I smelled on those steps was something different, sharper. And it was coming from above, not from the steps themselves." Watson looked at him. "From the Gargoyle?" "From the vicinity of the Gargoyle. I couldn't be certain from the steps. The angle was wrong and there were too many people nearby, various colognes and cigarettes and the general fog of a London street. But I was certain enough to want a closer look." He finally turned from the window and sat down in his chair, drawing one knee up. "Which means I need to get closer than the steps allow, considerably closer." "The police have presumably examined it." "The police have presumably looked at it from the steps, decided it was an unusual natural occurrence or a crude prank, and redirected their attention to finding Ashford through conventional means." He said this without contempt, simply as a statement of how things were likely to have proceeded. "They are not wrong to look for Ashford, but they are, I suspect, looking in the wrong direction." Watson set down his cup. "You think Ashford is connected to whatever is happening with the Gargoyle, not just a victim of circumstance?" Holmes was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bus went past on Baker Street, rattling slightly on the uneven road. "I think," he said carefully, "that a man who has run a library for 16 years does not vanish from it in the same week that his library becomes the subject of public fascination without there being a relationship between those 2 facts. Whether that relationship makes him a victim, a participant, or something more complicated than either, that I don't yet know." He stood abruptly, the way he sometimes did when a thought had reached the end of its useful road for the moment. "I'm going back to the Whitmore this morning. I need to get onto the roof." Watson put down his cup. "The roof. The Gargoyle projects from the arch above the entrance. To examine it properly, to get close enough to understand what that substance actually is, I need to approach it from above, which means the roof, or at least the upper exterior facade." He was already moving toward the bedroom to change. "I've telephoned Miss Fowler. She's agreed to let us in before the library opens to the public, 7 o'clock. Watson looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was 20 minutes to 7. "You might have mentioned this last night," he said. "You needed the sleep," Holmes said from the other room. "I didn't." The street outside the Whitmore Library at 7:05 on an October morning was empty and very cold. The fog was thicker than it had been the day before. A proper London fog, the kind that muffled sound and turned the street lamps into soft, blurred coins of yellow light. Watson turned up his collar and looked up at the library facade, just visible through the murk. Old Mordecai was up there somewhere in the grey above the arch, invisible at this distance in this light. Miss Fowler let them in through a side entrance, a narrow door set into the wall of the building, accessed through an iron gate off the main street. She was dressed as she had been the previous day, soon as though she had come in at her usual hour, and their presence before 7 o'clock was simply one more thing to be efficiently managed. The roof access is through the upper storeroom, she said, leading them up a back staircase that smelled of dust and old timber. There's a hatch. I'll need to find the key. It isn't used often. When was it last used? Holmes asked, climbing the stairs behind her. She considered. I couldn't say precisely. The maintenance company comes twice a year for the guttering. Last time would have been April, I think. Spring. And between April and now, any work done on the exterior stonework? Any reason for anyone to have been on the roof? Not that I'm aware of. She paused on the landing, half turning. Why? Just establishing what access has existed, Holmes said pleasantly. And she turned and continued up the stairs. The upper storeroom was a low-ceilinged space running across the back of the building's top floor, full of archive boxes, rolled maps, the skeletal frames of old display stands that had not been used in years. The hatch to the roof was in the far corner, set into the ceiling, with a folding metal ladder beneath it. Miss Fowler found the key on a hook inside the door and handed it to Holmes. He looked at it for a moment before using it. The lock, Watson noticed when they reached it, was not as stiff as a lock that was rarely used ought to be. Holmes inserted the key, turned it, and it moved with a smoothness that suggested recent use. The faint resistance of a lock that had been opened and relubricated, or simply opened often enough to stay free. Holmes said nothing about this. He simply noted it, in that invisible way he had, and pushed the hatch open. Cold air fell down through the opening. Holmes went up first, then Watson, then, after a moment's hesitation, Miss Fowler. The roof of the Whitmore Library was a broad, flat expanse of old lead sheeting, broken by chimney stacks and toward the front by the ornamental stonework of the facade, the carved cornice, the decorative urns at the corners, and at the centre, directly above the main entrance arch, the broad stone base from which old Mordecai projected outward and downward over the street. They crossed the roof carefully, the lead sheeting soft and slightly uneven underfoot. The fog was dense up here, denser than at street level if anything, and the city below was entirely invisible. The sounds of London came up muffled and strange, yet as though from a great distance. Holmes went directly to the gargoyle. It was larger than it appeared from the street. The carved figure was perhaps 4 feet from the base to the tip of its thrust-out jaw, crouched on its stone plinth with wings half-folded against its sides, the hollow eyes pointing outward and slightly downward toward the street below. Up close, the carving was remarkably detailed. Feathers indicated in the wings, sinew visible in the neck, the wide, flat face bearing an expression that Watson found at this proximity less grotesque and more simply very tired. A stone thing that had been watching the same street for 240 years and had seen quite enough of it. The dark staining around the eyes was more extensive from up here than it looked from below. The streaks ran from the inner corners of the hollows, down the carved cheeks, off the chin of the figure, and then along the stone arch below, darker at the source, fading as they reached lower. Holmes crouched beside the base of the figure and leaned in very close to the left eye socket. He was silent for nearly a full minute. Watson watched him. Miss Fowler stood a few feet back, arms folded against the cold, saying nothing. There, Holmes said quietly, almost to himself. Watson stepped forward and crouched beside him. He could see now, at this proximity, what Holmes was looking at. Inside the hollow of the eye socket, where the carved stone curved inward, there was a small hole. Not a natural feature of the stone, not a crack or a weathering pit. A hole, perhaps half an inch in diameter, clean-edged, bored through the stone from behind. And from that hole, even now in the dry cold of the morning, came a faint, faint smell. Watson knew it immediately. It took him a moment to place it. He associated it with the laboratory, with chemical experiments, with a particular category of solutions he hadn't worked with since his medical training. Ferrous compound, he said. Holmes looked at him with something that was almost, though not quite, a smile. Iron sulfate, I believe, possibly mixed with something to slow the rate of oxidation, to keep it liquid longer before it thickens. He stood and moved carefully around to the back of the gargoyle's base. And here, Watson followed, behind the stone plinth, Tucked into the narrow gap between the back of the carved figure and the facade wall was a small glass vessel, a flask, perhaps 6 inches tall, fitted with a rubber tube that ran through a channel bored into the back of the stone and connected, somewhere inside the carving, to the holes in the eye sockets. The flask was nearly empty now, but the residue inside it was dark reddish brown, and the smell from it was sharp and clear in the cold morning air. Iron sulfate solution, fed through a tube into the hollow eyes of the gargoyle, seeping out slowly, running down the stone face, leaving trails that dried to a dark rust-red-brown colour, exactly the colour of old blood. Watson straightened up slowly. He looked at Miss Fowler, who had come forward and was staring at the flask with an expression of such concentrated fury that he was briefly glad not to be on the receiving end of it. "Someone," she said, in a voice of very controlled quiet, "who has been up here." "More than once," Holmes said. He was examining the channel bored into the back of the stone. This wasn't done in an afternoon. The channel alone would have taken several visits. Someone had access to this roof over a period of time, weeks at minimum. They drilled slowly and carefully, working in short sessions so as not to be heard. They set up the flask. They have been coming back, presumably every 2 or 3 days, to refill it. He looked at her directly. "Who has a key to this roof, Miss Fowler?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, then said with great difficulty, "Mr. Ashford kept the master set." Holmes nodded slowly. "And," he said, in exactly the same tone, "I wonder if you would be good enough to show me when we go back downstairs, whether the key you gave me this morning was taken from the hook where it normally lives, or from somewhere else." Miss Fowler stared at him. Something shifted in her expression, the fury receding slightly, replaced by something more complicated. The particular expression Watson had learned to recognize of someone who has just understood that a question they thought was a simple one is not simple at all. "It was on the hook," she said, "where it always is." "Yes," Holmes said quietly. "I thought it might be." They stood on the roof for a little while longer. Holmes examined the lead sheeting near the hatch. There were marks, he pointed out to Watson, faint but consistent, where something had been set down repeatedly. A bag, perhaps, a case of some kind. The sort of marks left by equipment brought up and taken away again, at multiple times by someone who knew what they were doing and was taking some care not to leave obvious traces. Someone who knew this building, who knew its rhythms and its routines, who knew when it would be empty and when the roof hatch would not be noticed. On the way back down through the storeroom, Holmes paused at the hook inside the door where the roof key hung. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the wall beside it, where the pale paint held a faint rectangular ghost of something that had once hung there and no longer did. "What was kept there?" he asked Miss Fowler. "On that hook, before the key?" She looked, frowned. I'm not sure. I don't think anything has hung there in quite some time." "No," Holmes agreed, "quite some time, but not always nothing." He didn't explain. He thanked her, asked her to telephone him if anything changed, and they left through the side entrance as the first pale grey light of a proper morning was beginning to push through the fog. On the pavement, Watson turned up his collar and fell into step beside Holmes. "The flask," he said. "Someone has been manufacturing the effect deliberately, creating the appearance of a weeping gargoyle, a bleeding gargoyle, to drive people away from the library." "To drive people away from the library," Holmes agreed. "Or to drive them toward it. Attention and avoidance are not always opposites." He walked for a moment in silence. "But, yes, the primary effect has been to make people uncomfortable about entering the building, to thin the number of people going in and out, to make the library, particularly after dark when it is closed, less observed, less visited." Watson thought about this. "So that someone could use it?" "So that someone could use something about it," Holmes said. "The building itself, or something within it, or something beneath it." He stopped walking and stood for a moment on the empty pavement, hands in his coat pockets, looking back at the front face of the library just visible through the fog. The worn groove on the second step, something wheeled or dragged repeatedly across that stone. The bookshelf in Ashford's office that someone has moved and replaced, not quite correctly. He paused. And the key on the hook upstairs, which opens a roof that someone has been using for weeks, and which has never once been reported as disturbed. Watson looked at him. You think Ashford knew? Holmes was quiet. I think, he said after a moment, that there are several things I thought I understood this morning that I'm now not entirely sure about. He said it plainly, without drama. I may have made an assumption or two that I should not have made. Watson looked at him. In all their years together, he could count on one hand the number of times Holmes had said something like that. Which assumptions? He asked. Holmes turned and began walking again, his coat dark against the pale morning fog. That, he said, is what I need to work out. Beneath the superstition, there are certain moments in any investigation where the mind, having gathered enough pieces, begins to arrange them. Not always correctly. That is the part no one talks about. The part where the arrangement feels right, feels inevitable almost, and turns out to be wrong. Kept where the very sharpness of the mind becomes its own liability, because a sharp mind can construct a convincing shape out of almost anything, and convincing shapes are not always true ones. Holmes would not have admitted this to many people. He admitted it, in his way, to Watson. They were back at Baker Street by mid-morning, and Holmes had barely taken his coat off before he was at the desk, writing. Watson recognised this phase. It was the phase where everything observed got committed to paper in some form, organised, examined from different angles. Sometimes Holmes would write for an hour and burn everything he'd produced. Sometimes he would cover 3 sheets and pin them to the wall. This morning, he wrote steadily for 20 minutes, then sat back and looked at what he'd written with the expression of a man regarding a picture he's not sure he likes. Walk me through it, Watson said from his chair. Out loud. It helps you sometimes. Holmes looked at him. It helps me organise things I already know. It doesn't help me identify things I don't. Try anyway. A pause. Then Holmes picked up his papers and leaned back. Edmund Ashford, he began. 61 years old, 16 years as head librarian. Widower, no family in London. A man of, by all accounts, absolute routine and impeccable professional conduct. No financial irregularities on record. I had Lestrade check that yesterday evening. No known associations outside the library and a small circle of professional acquaintances. He tapped the papers against his knee. He disappears on October the 14th. His flat is undisturbed. He takes nothing with him, not his coat, not his glasses, not the book he was reading, which tells us either that he left in great haste, under some kind of compulsion, or he didn't leave through his front door at all, Watson finished. Or that, yes. Holmes set the papers down. The Gargoyle apparatus had been in place for at minimum 2 to 3 weeks before Ashford disappeared. The drilling of the channels, the sourcing of the materials, the installation of the flask, that requires time, knowledge of the building, and access to the roof outside normal hours. As Miss Fowler confirmed, Ashford held the master keys. Watson nodded carefully. The bookshelf in his office, Holmes continued, has been moved from the wall and replaced, not precisely enough. The groove on the second step suggests something heavy being moved through the front entrance repeatedly. Both observations are consistent with activity taking place in the building outside opening hours, activity requiring the participation, or at minimum the knowledge, of someone with unrestricted access. He stood and went to the window. And so, he said, the picture that presents itself is this. Edmund Ashford, for reasons as yet unclear, was involved in whatever operation was using the Whitmore Library. The Gargoyle apparatus was either his work or work he permitted. He has not fled in a panic. He has gone somewhere specific, deliberately, taking nothing because he either has what he needs already elsewhere or because he intended to create the appearance of an involuntary disappearance. Watson was quiet for a moment. You're saying he staged it? I'm saying the evidence as I currently have it points in that direction. A man who has 16 years of intimate knowledge of a building, who holds the master keys, whose office contains a recently disturbed bookshelf that he would certainly have noticed and corrected if anyone else had moved it, who vanishes leaving everything in its place. Holmes paused. It is a coherent picture. It is, Watson agreed. And then carefully, is it the right one? Holmes turned from the window. He looked at Watson for a moment with an expression that was not quite irritation and not quite appreciation, but something in between. I don't know, he said, and the fact that he said it, plainly without qualification, told Watson more than a longer answer would have. The telegram arrived at 11:30. It was from Lestrade, and it was brief in the way Lestrade's communications tended to be brief. Not from elegance, Watson had always thought, but from a certain impatience with the written word that expressed itself in the omission of anything that felt like a nicety. Development at Whitmore Stop have man in custody. Stop come if you want to see stop. Lestrade Holmes read it once, handed it to Watson, and was already reaching for his coat. The man in custody was not Edmund Ashford. He was a thick-set fellow of perhaps 45, with a broad red face and the hands of someone who worked physically for a living. Large, calloused, the knuckles slightly thickened. He was sitting in the small office that Miss Fowler had reluctantly surrendered to Lestrade's temporary use, and he was not, Watson noted immediately, behaving like a man who had been caught doing something. He was behaving like a man who was furious at being detained, which was a subtly different thing. His name, Lestrade explained in the corridor, was Raymond Holt. He was a builder, ran a small outfit, 2 or 3 men, general maintenance and renovation work. He had been found that morning in the library's back courtyard, attempting to access a ground-floor window from outside. He had tools with him, Lestrade said. Crowbar, torch, canvas bag. Was the window locked? Holmes asked. Yes, he hadn't got it open yet. And he says, Lestrade made a face, he says he was hired to do a job, refuses to say by whom, says the money was good, and he was told it was legitimate access, that the building owner had authorised the work. Holmes looked through the small window in the office door at Raymond Holt, who was currently staring at the far wall with the expression of a man mentally rehearsing a long list of grievances. Has he said what the job was? Holmes asked. Shifting something, that's all he'll give us. Shifting something from inside the building to outside, loading it onto a van. He says he didn't ask what. And you believe him? Lestrade tilted his head in a way that meant, mostly. He's not a clever liar, and the story has the ring of truth to it. He genuinely seems annoyed rather than frightened, which is more consistent with a man who thinks he's been made a fool of than a man who knows exactly what he was involved in. Holmes nodded slowly. He was still looking through the window at Holt. Watson watched him, and Watson noticed, because he had known Holmes long enough to notice such things, a particular quality of stillness that had come over him in the last 2 or 3 minutes. Not the stillness of focused attention, the stillness of something else. Something that looked, if Watson were being precise about it, like the very early stage of doubt. May I speak with him? Holmes asked. Lestrade stood aside. Holmes sat across from Raymond Holt for perhaps 15 minutes. Watson stood in the corner and listened, and what struck him most was not anything Holt said, though he said quite a lot, once Holmes had set him at ease with a manner that was considerably warmer than his usual interview style, but the way Holmes listened, with a particular quality of attention that Watson associated with moments when the thing being said was not quite what had been expected. Holt had been contacted 3 weeks ago. A telephone call, a man's voice, educated, he said, older, careful. The job was described vaguely. Access to a building, removal of certain items from a specific room, transport to a location he would be given at the time. Good money, half up front. The building was described as one where the caller had access rights and where the work needed to be done quietly, outside hours to avoid disrupting the normal operation. Did he give you a name? Holmes asked. No. Did he give you any description of himself? Holt thought about it. He said he knew the building well, said he'd worked there a long time. Those were his exact words. He'd worked there a long time. Near enough, yeah. Holmes sat for a moment. The room, he said. Did he describe which room the items were to be taken from? Holt frowned. He said the back, said there was a room at the back of the ground floor with access to the courtyard side. Said I'd know it when I found it. There'd be a shelf unit that wasn't fixed to the wall. Something changed in the room at that point, very slightly. Watson felt it before he understood it. Holmes went very still. A shelf unit, he said. That wasn't fixed to the wall. That's what he said. Holmes thanked him. He stood, nodded to Lestrade, and walked out of the office. Watson followed. In the corridor, Holmes walked a few paces and then stopped. He stood with his back to Watson, facing the corridor wall, and was quiet for 10 seconds or so. Then he said, without turning, I've been wrong. Watson said nothing. The bookshelf in Ashford's office, I assumed it had been moved by Ashford, that it was evidence of his involvement. I constructed a sequence around that assumption. He turned now, and his expression was the particular one Watson had seen perhaps 4 times in their entire acquaintance. Not embarrassment, Holmes was not easily embarrassed, but a kind of clean, direct acknowledgement, stripped of any attempt to manage its implications. Ashford did not move that shelf. Someone moved it looking for something that Ashford, presumably, had hidden or stored behind it, and Ashford is not a man who staged his own disappearance. "He's a victim," Watson said quietly. "He is a victim," Holmes said, "who almost certainly knows something, or has something, that the people behind this very much want, and I have wasted the better part of a morning building a case against a man who is probably in considerable danger." He said it flatly, without theatre, as a fact. That was careless. Watson looked at him for a moment. "You had the same evidence anyone would have had," he said. "I had more," Holmes said simply. "That's rather the point." It was Watson who found the next piece, and he would later think about this with a certain quiet satisfaction, not because it reflected poorly on Holmes, but because it reminded him that observation is not the exclusive property of genius. Sometimes it is simply a matter of looking at the thing that is directly in front of you, which genius occasionally fails to do because it is too busy looking at everything else. They were in the reading room. Holmes was standing near the back, thinking in that way he had where his body was present, and his mind was somewhere considerably further away. Watson was drifting, not quite purposefully, along the shelves near the main entrance, the old habit of a reader, running a finger along spines, reading titles without necessarily intending to. He stopped, on the bottom shelf of the farthest bookcase from the entrance, a low shelf, the kind that requires crouching to read properly. There was a gap, not a large gap, perhaps 2 inches. The books on either side of it were pressed together, which meant the gap had been there long enough for them to relax inward slightly. Watson crouched down. The gap was at floor level. Behind it, just visible in the shadow at the back of the shelf against the baseboard, was a small piece of paper, folded twice. He picked it up. It was a note, handwritten, small, careful letters, the hand of someone educated and precise, written in a hurry. It said, "They are using the lower passage. I cannot go to the police. If something happens to me, look beneath." That was all. Watson stood up slowly. He looked across the room at Holmes, who had turned and was watching him with sharp attention. "Holmes," Watson said. He held up the note. Holmes crossed the room in 6 steps. He read it once. Then he looked at Watson with an expression that contained, among other things, something Watson could only describe as relief. Not at the finding of the note, but at something more particular than that, at being wrong in a way that could still be corrected. "He left this," Holmes said, "before he disappeared. He knew something was coming." "He was trying to warn someone," Watson said. "Anyone." Holmes folded the note carefully and put it in his coat pocket. "Right," he said. He looked at the floor, at the shelves, at the faint, almost imperceptible lines in the old floorboards that ran from the far corner of the room toward the wall. "I believe," he said quietly, "that it is time to look beneath." The underground truth. The floorboards did not give themselves up easily. Holmes spent nearly 20 minutes on his hands and knees in the far corner of the reading room before he found it. And even then, Watson suspected, he would have found it faster if he hadn't spent the first 10 minutes looking in the wrong corner entirely. He said nothing about this. He simply moved, with the quiet, unhurried practicality of a man correcting his own course, and began again. What he was looking for, and what he eventually found, was a seam, not a crack. The boards were old enough and settled enough that there were cracks everywhere, the natural geography of 200 years of timber, contracting and expanding through London winters and summers. This was different. This was a seam that ran with a faint, deliberate straightness across 4 boards near the base of the far wall, a straightness that nature does not produce, that only intention produces. And at one end of it, barely visible unless the light caught it at precisely the right angle, a small brass fitting flush with the wood, the kind that could be mistaken for an old nail head, unless you were looking for something that was not a nail head. Holmes pressed it. Nothing happened immediately. Then, with a low sound that was more felt than heard, a deep resonant click from somewhere below, a section of the floor shifted, not dramatically. It did not swing up on theatrical hinges or drop away into darkness. It simply loosened, became separate from the boards around it, and when Holmes got his fingers into the seam and lifted, it came up smoothly and revealed a square opening approximately 3 feet across, dropping into darkness below. Cold air rose from it. The particular cold of underground spaces, stale and still, carrying in it the smell of damp stone and something else, something faintly chemical that Watson recognized from the roof. He and Holmes looked at each other across the opening. "How long do you think this has been here?" Watson asked. Holmes was examining the underside of the lifted section, the mechanism, the hinges, the wear on the wood at the edges of the opening. "The hinge fittings are newer than the floor, installed within the last year, I'd say, possibly less. But the passage below..." He tilted his head, listening to the quality of the silence from below, in that odd way he had. "The passage below is considerably older. This opening was cut into an existing structure. Someone found something that was already here and made it accessible." Watson looked down into the darkness. "Ashford?" "Possibly, or whoever Ashford discovered using it." Miss Fowler, who had been standing in the doorway of the reading room since they had come back inside, and who had been maintaining with considerable effort the expression of a woman who was managing events rather than being managed by them, came forward now and looked down into the opening. Her face, Watson noted, was unreadable. "Did you know this was here?" Holmes asked her, gently, not accusatorially. "No," she said. A single syllable, clean and certain. And then, after a moment, "Edmund knew this building better than anyone, better than I do. If there was something to find in it, he would have found it." "Yes," Holmes said. "I think he did." He had brought a torch. He had, Watson reflected, come prepared for this in a way that suggested he had already suspected the note's instruction before Watson had found the note, which was either remarkable foresight or something he would decline to explain. He clicked it on. He directed the beam downward, and they saw a short wooden ladder fixed to the inner wall of the opening, leading down perhaps 8 feet to a stone floor. Holmes went first. The passage was not large. It was, Watson estimated, as he descended the ladder and straightened up, perhaps 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, narrow enough that a broad-shouldered man would have found it uncomfortable, but manageable for most. The walls were old brick and older stone, the kind of construction that predated the library itself. This passage, or whatever it had originally been, was part of an earlier structure, perhaps part of the original foundations of whatever had stood on this site before the library was built in 1741. The floor was stone-flagged, worn smooth and not entirely clean. Holmes directed his torch along the floor and Watson saw it immediately. Tracks. Not footprints exactly, but the marks left by something wheeled repeatedly along the centre of the passage. The same kind of marks, Watson thought, as the groove on the second step outside. Whatever was being moved through this passage was being moved on something with wheels, a trolley, a cart, something designed for the purpose. The passage ran in one direction from the base of the ladder, away from the library, toward the street. They followed it. It was perhaps 60 feet long. At various points along the walls, Watson noticed evidence of recent activity. Scrapes in the old brick where something had been carried past too close to the wall, a fragment of packing material caught in a crack in the mortar. A dark stain on the floor that might have been oil from a wheel mechanism. None of it dramatic, all of it consistent, accumulating, pointing in the same direction. At the end of the passage, there was a door. It was a newer door than everything around it. Solid wood, well fitted, with a modern lock that looked entirely out of place in the ancient brick surround. Holmes examined the lock briefly, then produced from his coat pocket a small leather case that Watson recognized and chose not to comment upon. He worked for perhaps 45 seconds. The door opened. Beyond it was a larger space, a cellar, roughly rectangular, perhaps 20 feet by 30, with a low vaulted ceiling. Stone walls, stone floor. Single electric light, fitting overhead connected by a cable that ran up through the ceiling in a way that suggested someone had run it recently, and without great care for aesthetics. The light was off, but Holmes's torch swept the space, and Watson understood immediately, with a clarity that required no deduction at all, what he was looking at. The cellar was full. Not chaotically, not in the way of a space used for dumping or storage in the casual sense, but organized methodically, with the particular tidiness of people who are moving things in volume and need to keep track of what is where. Along the left wall, wooden crates were stacked 2 and 3 high, each one stenciled in a language Watson didn't immediately recognize. Cyrillic lettering, he thought, or something close to it. Along the right wall, a long folding table held equipment, scales of the kind used for precise measurement, glass vessels, sealed containers of various sizes, a set of ledgers in a neat stack at one end. In the far corner, 2 large canvas bags sat packed and closed, as though prepared for transport. Holmes moved through the space slowly, torchlight traversing the walls and shelves, stopping at each point of interest for a moment before moving on. He did not touch anything. He looked at the crates, at the labels, at the equipment on the table, at the ledgers. He crouched beside one of the canvas bags and examined the outside of it without opening it. Watson moved to the table and looked at the scales. They were good quality, professional, precise, the kind used in chemistry or pharmacy. The glass vessels had residue in them, dark and slightly viscous. And the smell was the same chemical smell that had been present on the roof, present in the passage, threading through all of it like a signature. "What is it?" Watson asked. "What are they moving?" Holmes was at the ledgers. He opened the top one carefully and directed his torch across the pages. Columns of figures, dates, abbreviations that Watson couldn't read from where he stood. "Chemicals," Holmes said. "Precursor compounds, if I'm reading this correctly. The kind that are legal in certain quantities and certain contexts, but that become rather more interesting to the authorities when moved in these volumes, and without the appropriate documentation." He turned a page. "This operation has been running for at minimum 18 months, possibly longer." He looked up at Watson. "This is not a small enterprise. This is organised, resourced, and has been operating with considerable success directly beneath a public library in the middle of Bloomsbury for the better part of 2 years." Watson looked around the cellar. The crates, the equipment, the organised, methodical, utterly mundane apparatus of it. No drama, no theatre. Just the quiet machinery of a criminal enterprise that had found an excellent hiding place and taken care to keep it hidden. "The Gargoyle," Watson said. "The weeping Gargoyle. They used it to keep people away from the library. Fewer visitors, less foot traffic, less chance of someone noticing anything unusual about the building." "More than that," Holmes said. He had moved to the far wall now, where a second door, older, wooden, iron-fitted, stood slightly ajar. He pushed it open and directed his torch through. Beyond was another short passage, this one leading upward via a set of stone steps. "This connects to the street, not to the library, to the street. There is, I would guess, an exit somewhere along the side of the building, or in the adjacent alley, that allows materials to be moved in and out, without ever passing through the library at all." He let the door swing back. The library's passage was a secondary access route, used when the street exit was impractical or for moving smaller items. The groove on the step, the marks on the floor, someone was using the front entrance after hours to bring certain things in or take them out. Watson thought about this. They needed Ashford's keys. They needed Ashford's silence at minimum. His keys, possibly. Or they had their own copies made. Holmes closed the outer ledger and placed it back precisely where he had found it. But Ashford found out more than they intended him to know, and he left that note, which suggests he did not trust the official route for reasons we don't yet know. And then he disappeared. The word hung in the cold air of the cellar. Watson looked at the 2 packed canvas bags in the corner. He thought about a man of 61, of rigid routine, of impeccable professional record, who had run his library for 16 years, and one October morning had simply not come to work. "Do you think he's alive?" Watson asked. Holmes was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that if they had wanted him dead, the easiest course would have been to leave him in his flat. A body in an undisturbed flat. A man of his age with no family nearby. It would have taken days to find him and longer to investigate. The fact that he is missing rather than found suggests to me that they needed something from him. Information, perhaps, or something he had taken from this place." He looked at the ledgers. "These are copies. I'd stake a great deal on that. The real records are somewhere else, but Ashford, if he was watching this operation, if he understood what it was, Ashford may have the originals." "Which is why they took him," Watson said, "rather than simply removing him." "Which is why they took him, yes." They had been in the cellar for perhaps 30 minutes when Holmes found the third door. It was not a door exactly, more a section of wall that had been constructed to look like the rest of the wall. He fitted so carefully into the old stone that in the torchlight it was virtually invisible. Holmes found it not by looking, but by the slight change in the sound of the cellar, a faint echo, a hollowness in the air near the far left corner that suggested space beyond rather than solid earth. He pressed the wall at several points, and on the 4th attempt it gave, swinging inward on a hidden pivot, revealing a smaller room beyond. A room perhaps 10 feet square, stone-walled with no electric light and no window. A space that had been, by the look of it, used as a storage room within the larger cellar. and within the last several days used for something else. On the floor was a blanket, recently slept in. Beside it, a water canteen, empty. A small pile of books. 3 of them, Watson noted. Library books. Their spines stamped with the Whitmore crest. And on the wall nearest the blanket, scratched into the old stone with something small and sharp. A key, perhaps, or a coin. A series of marks. Not decorative. A record of days. 12 marks in groups. The way a prisoner counts time. Watson looked at it for a long moment. He was here, he said. Ashford was kept here. Recently, Holmes said. He was crouching over the blanket, the canteen. The water in this canteen was fresh within the last 48 hours. He has been moved, or he has left, very recently. Moved where? Holmes straightened. He stood in the middle of the small stone room, torch casting long shadows across the walls, and looked at the scratched marks, the empty canteen, the library books on the floor. He was quiet for several seconds. They knew we were coming, he said, or suspected that someone was coming. The canvas bags in the outer room, packed and ready. The ledgers that are copies rather than originals, and now this. He looked at the marks on the wall. 12 days. They have been clearing out. The operation is ending, not because it ran its natural course, but because something prompted them to wind it down quickly. Watson thought about it. The newspaper coverage, the police involvement, however superficial. The police involvement was superficial enough not to concern them for the first week. But Lestrade's man in custody this morning, Holt, that changes the shape of things. If Holt talks, and he will talk, the connection to this building becomes explicit. Holmes moved back toward the outer cellar. They will move tonight. Ashford with them, he stopped. Or not, Watson said. Or not, Holmes agreed. And the way he said it, without the usual precision, without the brackets and qualifications he habitually used to keep language honest, told Watson that he was not, at this particular moment, entirely certain of what he meant by it. They came back up through the passage and up the ladder into the reading room, and Holmes stood for a moment in the quiet library air, the familiar smell of old paper and furniture polish, and looked at Miss Fowler, who was waiting exactly where they had left her, as though she had not moved a single step in the 35 minutes they had been below. "I need you to do something for me," Holmes said, "and I need you to do it without asking questions you don't need the answers to yet." She looked at him steadily. "All right. Go about the rest of today as though nothing has happened. Open the library at the usual time. Run it as you always run it. If anyone asks about the investigation at the police, anyone, you have nothing new to report. You have seen nothing unusual today." Her expression did not change. "And Mr. Ashford?" Holmes held her gaze. "I'm going to find him," he said. "That is not a promise I make easily or often, but I am going to find him." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she gave a single, short nod, the nod of a woman who has decided to place a particular kind of trust in a particular kind of person and intends to honor that decision fully. "The library opens at 9, she said, and she went to unlock the front door. Holmes turned to Watson. "We have until tonight," he said. Possibly less. He was already moving toward the side entrance. "Come, I need to send several telegrams, make 2 telephone calls, and I need to think, properly think, about a piece of this that I have not yet understood." Watson followed him out into the October morning. The fog had lifted slightly. The street was beginning to wake. A milk cart at the far end, a shopkeeper opening a shutter, the first ordinary sounds of an ordinary London day getting underway. Above the library entrance in the pale morning light, old Mordecai stared out at the street with his hollow eyes. Dry now, empty. The flask on the roof was nearly exhausted, and no one had come to refill it. The reckoning. The telegrams went to Lestrade, 3 of them. He sent from the post office on Montague Street, the last one asking him to position men at the alley beside the Whitmore Library by 8 o'clock, and to watch the street exit of the cellar passage from 3 onward. Quietly, no uniforms. Holmes did not tell Lestrade about the warehouse. The warehouse on Lee Street was 4 minutes from the library. Holmes had known about it since Lestrade's second telegram, a unit leased 14 months ago, registered to a company called Morven Holdings, director listed as one G. Fowler. He had said nothing about it to Watson until they were already on the street outside, because he had learned something that morning about the cost of speaking too soon. The building was modest, unremarkable, the kind of place that existed by the dozen in this part of London. A light burned in the upper floor. Holmes looked at it from across the street for a moment, then said, "He'll be here, or the people who have him will be." They went in through the side entrance. The lock took nearly 2 minutes. Watson stood with his back to the door, watching the street, his hand in his coat pocket, feeling the cold and that particular heightened quality of the air he associated with these moments. Not fear, exactly. A readiness. The lock gave. The ground floor was empty in the way a space is empty when it has recently been full. The rectangular ghosts of crates on the floor, scuff marks, the faint chemical smell that had threaded through this entire case from the very beginning. Whatever had been stored here had been moved in the last 24 hours, but there was light upstairs, and voices. They went up the metal staircase slowly, Holmes first, or Watson close behind. The upper floor was a long room, windows blinded with drawn shades. At a table near the far end sat 2 people, and on the floor at the side of the room, propped against the wall with his hands bound in front of him, was Edmund Ashford. He was alive. He looked diminished, thinner, very tired, with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been frightened for a long time without adequate sleep. But his eyes, when he looked up and saw them, held something Watson found immediately reassuring: recognition, comprehension, the eyes of a man whose mind was completely intact. The man at the table, heavy-set, perhaps 50, with the careful stillness of someone always assessing exits, came to his feet very fast. Holmes said, "I would strongly advise against whatever you're about to do. There are police officers surrounding the building your colleagues are currently attempting to vacate, and 2 more men outside this building who are here because I telegraphed Inspector Lestrade 4 hours ago." This was not entirely true, but Holmes delivered it with a precision that made it sound like completed fact, and the man made the calculation that the bluff required him to make. He sat down slowly. Glenys Fowler had not moved throughout any of this. She was looking at Holmes across the table with an expression that was not what Watson had expected. Not defiance, not panic. Just a flat, tired acknowledgement. The expression of someone who had known for some time that a particular moment was coming and had arrived somewhere beyond surprise. "How long?" Holmes asked her. 2 years, she said. Almost exactly. And Ashford found out. 3 months ago, he was always poking about in the building, always knew every inch of it. She said it without bitterness, simply as fact. I tried to convince him it was minor, that no one was being hurt. A pause. He didn't accept that. No, Holmes said. I imagine he didn't. He said he was going to the police. I asked him to wait, to give me time to end it. He waited 2 weeks, and then I could see he was going to do it regardless. She looked at the papers in front of her. I didn't hurt him. I want you to know that. Whatever else, I didn't hurt him. Watson had already crossed the room and crouched beside Ashford, pulse steady, eyes clear. The binding on his wrists tight but not damaging. He looked up and found Ashford looking back at him with that alert, exhausted gaze. "Can you stand?" Watson asked quietly. Yes. His voice was rough from disuse. Yes, I think so. Watson helped him to his feet. His legs were unsteady but held. Watson kept a hand at his elbow and felt the man straighten, a visible act of will, the body recovering its habitual posture. There was something about the way Edmund Ashford stood up that told you everything you needed to know about who he was. Behind them, Lestrade's men came through the downstairs entrance. It took another hour, as these things always do. The foreign national was on an Interpol list. Miss Fowler was taken into custody without resistance, without theatre, with the same composure she had maintained throughout. 2 more men were apprehended at the library street exit, precisely where Holmes had predicted. Ashford gave his statement the following morning. Careful, thorough, the statement of a man who had been composing it in his head for 12 days underground, and was glad finally to say it aloud. Holmes sat with him briefly that evening in the hospital room. Watson spoke with the doctor in the corridor, and did not hear most of the conversation. But when Holmes came out, he paused in the doorway and looked back at Ashford with an expression Watson had no ready name for. Not satisfaction, not the clean completion of a solved problem. Something quieter. He was doing exactly what I would have done, Holmes said in the corridor. Watching, gathering evidence, trusting no one. A 61-year-old librarian conducting his own quiet investigation into a criminal network, while seeing the person most likely to be informed of any official action every single working day. He paused. The only mistake he made was underestimating how quickly they would move. He was brave, Watson said simply. Yes, Holmes said. He was. A short silence, the ordinary hospital sounds around them. I should have seen Fowler sooner, Holmes said. Not heavily, just plainly, cleanly, a fact he was choosing to carry honestly. You saw her, Watson said, a few hours later than you might have. A few hours mattered. They moved Ashford because of the time I lost. And we found him tonight, alive, rather than tomorrow, which might have had a different result. Holmes looked at him. You're being kind? I'm being accurate, Watson said, which is, as you've told me on at least 40 occasions, considerably more useful. Holmes almost smiled. Brief, real, gone quickly. Come, he said. I need dinner, and Lestrade will want a full account in the morning, which will require me to have slept, or I shall say something impolite to him before he's finished his first sentence. Ashford sent Holmes a note the following week, short as notes from precise and private men tend to be. Mr. Holmes, I understand that your involvement was the reason I came home. I am not a man who says thank you easily, and so when I say it, I hope you will understand that I mean it entirely. E. Ashford Holmes read it at breakfast, said nothing, then put it in the inside pocket of his coat, not in the drawer where correspondence was filed, not on the mantelpiece, in his coat. Watson noted this. Holmes did not explain it. It needed no explanation. That evening Holmes sat in his chair as the last October light left the sky over Baker Street, and Watson was in his own chair with a book, and it was quiet in the way Baker Street was sometimes quiet. Not empty, not still, but settled. After a while, Holmes said, the gargoyle was always just a gargoyle. Stone, placed there 240 years ago to direct water away from the arch. Nothing more. And people looked at it for 2 weeks and saw omens, signs, supernatural distress. Built an entire architecture of meaning around a chemical solution in a glass flask. Watson looked up from his book. Every mysterious thing has a mechanism, Holmes continued. Every weeping stone has a flask. The task is simply to look long enough and carefully enough to find it. And when you look carefully enough and still get it wrong in the middle, he paused. You correct it, and you keep going. The last light faded. Holmes reached for his violin. Something slow, searching, without a name. Watson opened his book and this time actually read it, and the music moved through the sitting room like something that knew exactly where it was going and was in no particular hurry to get there. Outside, old Mordecai stared down at the empty street, dry-eyed, as he always should have been,